The forest was unusually silent that morning. Shafts of pale sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of pine and spruce, their needles glistening with dew that refused to fall. The air held a strange weight, not heavy, not storm-laden, but still, like something was waiting. A young deer, barely past its second winter, moved carefully along a worn animal trail near the foot of Ridge Hollow. Its hooves barely made a sound against the spongy bed of pine needles and dry moss. Every so often it paused, ears flicking, not at sound, but at the absence of it. There were no birds, no squirrels, not even the usual buzz of morning flies near the fallen logs. Then it happened. A moment so subtle it might have passed unnoticed by human eyes, but not by the deer. Its foreleg lifted, began to step, and stopped, frozen midair. A faint shiver passed through the ground beneath its hoof. Not a tremor, more like a pulse, a deep, quiet thud from far below the forest floor. Felt, not heard. The deer's wide, dark eyes locked onto the forest ahead, not with fear, but with instinctive confusion, the kind passed through generations. Something was wrong with the earth. Behind it, another doe paused as well, and then another. Within seconds, 5 deer stood still in a clearing that had, moments before, seemed harmless. None ran. None fled. They simply stood in place, heads raised, ears twitching, legs tense, as if the very air had turned solid around them. A crow took off in the distance, screeching once before disappearing over the treetops. Nearby, just across a narrow ridge, a wildlife ranger named Ellis Monroe leaned against a cedar trunk, binoculars in hand. He had been tracking the deer population for weeks as part of a migration study. But now, all thoughts of data collection faded. He noticed what the deer noticed. The change. Not in the weather, not in the wind, but in the ground. He crouched, pressed a hand to the soil, and felt it, the faintest quiver, like a giant exhaling through clenched teeth. It was fleeting, gone in a breath. But it was real. Ellis slowly rose, gaze fixed toward the tree line beyond the deer. And for the first time in his years, working the northern valley, he realized something chilling. The forest had gone quiet because the animals were listening. And what they heard was coming from below. Ellis Monroe sat at his field station that afternoon, eyes locked on a series of seismograph printouts scattered across the table. The data was sparse, inconclusive, and almost laughably quiet, if not for one thing, a consistent pattern of low-frequency vibrations showing up every 90 to 110 minutes. Not strong enough to trigger official alerts, not even enough to trip the older analog monitors, but present and growing. He turned the page. Same signal, same depth, same signature. A distant groan pulsing upward from beneath the valley floor. Across the room, a local ecologist named Rhea Keller stirred sugar into a chipped mug of coffee, watching him. "You think it's tectonic?" Ellis didn't look up. "It's not geothermal. I checked with the park geologists. The magma pockets here are cold. No thermal bulge, no water table expansion. So it's movement. Yeah, deep movement. Building pressure. Maybe he finally looked at her. The kind that loosens something old." That morning, after the deer froze, Ellis had driven through Ridge Hollow and into adjacent canyons. Everywhere he went, the story repeated itself. Wildlife on alert, birds moving out of season, insects abandoning fallen wood en masse. Even a badger, known for ignoring most noise and traffic, had bolted from its den the moment Ellis stepped within 20 meters. Nature wasn't fleeing. Nature was bracing. Outside the station window, clouds began to gather over the ridgelines. Not storm clouds, just thick, slow-moving masses that dimmed the afternoon sun. Shadows crept across the basin, and the silence returned. Rhea walked over to the topographic map pinned to the wall. Her fingers traced the shape of the valley, a horseshoe-shaped bowl surrounded by high granite walls and ancient fault scars that hadn't shifted in over a century. What if this is foreshock behavior? She asked. Low magnitude quivers, animal response. It's textbook. But there's no Quake history here, Ellis said, not for decades. She looked at him. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's overdue. Ellis rose slowly and crossed to the radio desk. He tuned to the Ranger emergency band, just to listen. Static. Then a weather update. Then nothing. The station felt too quiet. Far too still. In that moment, both he and Rhea turned instinctively to the window. A small group of deer, the same ones perhaps, now stood just at the edge of the tree line. Not grazing, not moving. Just watching. Frozen again. And beneath the soles of their boots, the ground gave off one more faint pulse, like the warning beat of a drum, buried under miles of earth. It was coming, and nature already knew. Beneath the Ridge Hollow Basin, where roots no longer reached and the weight of the mountains pressed without mercy, the earth shifted in silence. No one saw it, no one could, but if they could have listened, truly listened, they'd have heard the deep rhythmic groaning of stone folding under stone, as if the valley itself were grinding its teeth. Seismic monitors in the regional office registered it as minor, tremors too subtle to draw concern, dismissed by analysts as tectonic fatigue, a common phenomenon in older formations. But the valley knew better, and so did the animals. That evening, Rhea drove north to check the Upper Rim Trail camera feeds. What she found startled her. Entire herds had moved away from the lower gorge. Elk, deer, even coyotes had shifted upslope, clustering in areas they usually avoided due to mountain lion presence. The ecosystem was rearranging itself, not out of panic, but preparation. Ellis stayed behind, monitoring the old analog sensors he'd rigged long ago, ones that measured not just ground vibration, but pressure differentials in the soil and the faint acoustic signatures generated deep underground. One feed caught his attention, a low, rising hum. He listened to the playback again. The hum wasn't mechanical, it wasn't wind. It was a sustained frequency, too deep for human ears, but very much alive within the earth. It rose over time, building like tension pulled across a tight rope. The pitch never broke. It only grew denser. Ellis looked up from the monitor as the floor beneath his boots gave the faintest tug, a nearly imperceptible jolt, like the breath before a sigh. At that same moment, miles away on a logging road near the South Gorge, a doe collapsed mid-step. No wounds, no predators, just a sudden seizure and stillness. Forest medics later found no trauma, but noted unusual inner ear damage, ruptured from inside. The pressure had become too much. By midnight, shallow fissures had appeared near the northern edge of the basin, hairline splits in the dry riverbed, radiating like lightning from a single invisible center. Water from a nearby spring disappeared into one of the cracks, swallowed with no splash, no sound. The creek died in silence. The earth below wasn't just moving, it was communicating, warning in groans, pressure, and ruptures. And only the wild things could still hear it clearly. And all the while the deer remained at the tree line, unmoving, unblinking, as if standing guard at the gate to something ancient, something waking. Dawn brought a thin golden haze over Ridge Hollow, painting the treetops with soft light. But the beauty was a mask. Beneath it, something had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but viscerally. The ground no longer felt steady. It pulsed now, faintly and irregularly, like the chest of a great beast dreaming uneasily beneath the forest floor. Ellis walked the perimeter of the valley alone, his steps deliberate. The earth was too quiet for his liking. Even the usual birdsong was thin, scattered chirps instead of full morning choruses. He stopped to rest near an old pine that had started leaning slightly, its base cracked in a way he hadn't seen yesterday. The lean wasn't from wind, it was from displacement. Further ahead, he spotted them again, the same deer from before, still at the tree line, still frozen. Their stance hadn't changed. It was as if time moved around them, but not through them. He watched in silence. One of the younger bucks twitched its ears, but didn't move. Its hooves stood inches from a narrow crack that had widened overnight. It looked down, not in fear, but in recognition. The herd didn't flee. They simply refused to step forward. Not out of cowardice, but knowledge. Ellis took a cautious step closer. The buck lifted its head and locked eyes with him. For a fleeting second, something ancient passed between them. Not fear, not challenge, but shared tension. A primal knowing. Then Ellis felt it. A tremor. Short and sharp. Not a rolling quake. A snap. The trees groaned. The pine needles shivered. A small burst of dust rose from the forest floor as a nearby rock crumbled inward. The crack by the deer's hooves grew another inch wider, and yet the deer did not bolt. Their survival wasn't in running, it was in sensing the moment before the moment, holding ground just before the threshold of collapse. Ellis stepped back instinctively. He raised his radio, called into the ranger channel, voice low but urgent. Monroe to base. Active surface shift. Ridge Hollow North Perimeter. Animal behavior still frozen. I think we're right at the edge. He paused. No sirens yet. No warnings. But the land's talking. Silence followed. Then, a faint crack echoed across the hollow. Sharp. Dry. Final. A massive root from the leaning pine tore free from the ground behind him, ripping the earth like paper. It fell slowly, groaning like something alive, slamming into the ground in a burst of dust and pine needles. And still, the deer stood, unmoved. That was the moment Ellis understood. The quake wouldn't start with thunder. It would begin with stillness. The forest no longer whispered. It held its breath. Ellis returned to the station by noon, his truck humming uneasily over gravel that seemed rougher than the day before. Rhea was already inside, hunched over a thermal satellite overlay. She didn't look up. There's heat rising from the valley floor, she said. Not much, but not from the sun either. It's like the ground's exhaling, Ellis finished, tossing his backpack onto the bench. I know. They didn't speak for a moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the radio, still locked to the emergency band. No chatter, no alerts, no orders. Just silence. Outside, clouds gathered once more over the ridgeline, low, dense, and oddly still, as if resting directly atop the mountains without moving. Wind that should have carried them simply didn't. It was like the air itself was thickening. Animals continued to vanish from their usual ranges. Trail cameras showed foxes trotting up switchbacks in full daylight. A bear had been seen wading upriver, going against the current, behavior neither ranger had seen in years. Instincts were in revolt. Ellis stared at the old analog pressure gauge near the window. It was twitching, not dropping or rising, but pulsing, like a heartbeat with no rhythm. And beneath the floorboards, he felt it again. A dull, steady pressure, like the ground was inflating. Not violently, just persistently, invisibly. That night, the wind refused to blow. And then, the dreams came. Ellis didn't believe in premonitions, but he woke before dawn, heart pounding, throat dry, skin cold. He swore he'd heard something deep, not with his ears, but in his bones. A grinding sound, a slow rupture from beneath him. He sat upright. Outside the window, the deer were gone. Not scattered, not fled, just gone. As if they'd melted back into the trees without sound or trail. Only a ring of fresh hoofprints remained, perfectly circling a widening fissure in the ground, like they had been standing guard one final time. He stepped outside, boots crunching over loose soil that felt hollow. Then came the sound. Not an explosion. Not thunder. But a deep, subsonic throb. The sound of tension no longer restrained, and the forest, at last, began to tremble. It began with a sound like fabric tearing. Only it wasn't cloth. It was stone. A long, violent rip echoed from the northern ridge at exactly 6:42 a.m. A seismic event. Not large, not famous, but precise. Localized. Focused. Like a scalpel cutting through the surface of the earth. Ellis was already outside when it happened, boots rooted just beyond the ranger cabin, staring toward the tree line where the deer had stood for days. What he saw instead was motion, not of animals, of the ground itself. The ridge wall cracked. It didn't explode. It peeled, like a rusted door swinging open after centuries sealed shut. A slab of ancient granite, 30 meters tall and twice as wide, slid forward in slow, grinding defiance of gravity, then broke free. The sound that followed wasn't thunder. It was weight, an unimaginable weight slamming into the hollow floor with a force that made the trees stagger. Dirt lifted. Birds fled. The cabin windows bowed inward, and a wave of displaced air rushed down the slope like an invisible avalanche. From across the valley, a streak of dust curled into the sky, thin at first, then dense, choking, vast. The sun vanished behind it. Rhea burst from the cabin, notebook in hand, face pale. "What was that?" "Ridge collapse," Ellis said, barely audible over the echoes. "One slab." At least he pointed to the old observation tower across the valley, which now leaned awkwardly, 1 foot of its foundation swallowed by a fresh crevice. Rhea ran to the seismic monitor, watching the shaking persist. Not strong, but steady. It's still shifting. Not a main quake. This was prelude. Ellis's eyes narrowed. No, this was the quake. It just didn't come the way we thought. Silence returned in a way that wasn't comforting. It was raw, like all the sound had been wrung out of the air. The forest no longer held its breath. It had exhaled, violently. The animals were nowhere. Not a track, not a call. Only broken branches, trails erased by falling stone and sliding soil. Hours later, after the dust began to settle, the aerial drones would reveal the truth. A half-kilometer scar, running through Ridge Hollow, like a surgical incision, straight and deep. The land had cleaved inward, not outward, swallowed, not split. The ground hadn't erupted, it had sunk, and the deer had known. Ellis stood at the edge of the fissure, now stretching wider with each passing minute. He didn't feel victorious for surviving. He felt humbled, not by nature's violence, but by the creatures who listened before it came. The forest would never be the same. Ridge Hollow was no longer a quiet basin between old mountains. It was a wound, a raw, gaping scar stretched across the land, slicing apart ecosystems, trails, memories. And yet, in the wake of the Earth's subtle violence, one truth stood out above the rest. The deer had warned them. In the days following the collapse, teams of scientists, rangers, geologists, and drone crews scoured the area. Satellite imaging confirmed it wasn't just a surface-level event. The rupture connected to an ancient, unknown subduction seam deep underground, one no modern system had mapped, one that had been pressing upward for centuries, masked by layers of sediment and time. But it hadn't been the machines that noticed, not the monitors, not the algorithms. It was the animals, first the deer, then the foxes, the birds, even the insects. They had detected the shift long before it reached measurable thresholds, a kind of earthborn frequency, inaudible to humans, but clear as thunder to the creatures who still listened with instinct older than fear. Ellis gave his final report beside the rim of the scar, eyes sweeping over the blackened pine trunks and crumbled stone where the ridge had once towered. "Whatever's coming next," he said quietly to Rhea, "we need to stop thinking we're the first to know." She nodded, eyes misty. They didn't run because they were afraid. They stayed because they remembered. They both turned toward the trees beyond the fissure. In the distance, barely visible among the last of the dust and broken light, a young doe stepped from the shadows. Alone. Calm. She stood at the edge of the new landscape, the broken, reshaped land, and looked forward. No fear, no hesitation. just recognition, as if to say, "It's begun again. Are you ready this time?" And then she turned, slipping silently into the trees, her hooves making no sound at all.